So let's review a little bit about what we've been going through. We are in the 4th chapter of Galatians. We will finish it today. We are in the second part, starting with the verses 21 and on. Let me give you a brief little recap of what has happened before. I can't review all the previous chapters that we have studied, but just the very recent things that have happened in this particular letter to Galatians. Shaul has explained to Galatians that they have already been accepted by God. We've been over that. Their acceptance into the family was witnessed by miracles. The presence of the Spirit in their lives signifies the fact that they are His. They have received the promise that many Israelites are still yet to receive. This is what Shaul is saying. At stake right now in this particular letter where we're studying is the demonstration that God's word is true, that the promises made to Abraham are true. So that's what's at stake. In Shaul's view, the nations must be blessed by Abraham. That is what was promised by God, that in you all the nations will be blessed. So in Shaul's view, that's what's supposed to happen. And now this is coming true. The Galatians are the example of those Gentiles coming to know the God of Israel in the way that it hasn't happened before. So in his understanding, God must have a plan for Gentiles, and they're supposed to remain Gentiles. Shaul has just expressed his fatherly feelings in this chapter towards Galatians. You remember reading some very warm words that he had for them. And he cautioned them in a very fatherly way against the teachers that come to confuse them. We still don't know who these teachers are because their identity actually never becomes clear. Now, in the second part of chapter 4, he decides to speak to them the same message that he has already spoken, but in a slightly different way. He chooses a medium of allegory this time. So, we begin in verse 21. I'm going to read a couple of verses 21 and 22, and we'll stop there and discuss a few things. Shaul is writing, "Tell me, you who want to be under law, do you not listen to the law? For it is written that Abraham had 2 sons, one by bondwoman and one by the free woman." So let's stop there for a second. So in verse 21, what we're seeing is that Galatians, they want to be under the law. What does it mean to be under the law? Meaning they want to be Jews. They want to be answerable to the law. To be under the law means to stand and answer to the law. So they want to be circumcised. They want to become Jews. So he says, okay, you want to be circumcised? You want to become Jews? Let me ask you this question. Do you even hear what the Torah teaches? Do you even understand it? He's challenging them. Do you understand the message that the law gives us? So this little intro, by the way, is designed to attract attention. He's just trying to get their attention so that he can be heard what he says next. So he tells them that they're missing some big point of Torah, what it teaches, and thus he begins his little story, his little midrash, his little allegory. So in verse 22, he starts the story. He tells Galatians that Abraham had 2 sons. Everybody knows that. One from a woman who is not free, and one from a woman who is free. So what's so difficult to understand here? Well, number one, to understand what Shaul means, when he says such things, one has to understand his terminology. And the book of Galatians is simply full of his terminology. Sometimes Shaul's terminology is unique to him alone. Sometimes it is unique to the particular letter that he's writing because he addresses a particular issue that he will not be addressing somewhere else. So it's very important that we truly understand what he means by the words he uses before we can proceed to saying, okay, we fully understand what in the world he's trying to say by that. So the midrash, the allegory that he's going to use, has to be interpreted within the things that he has already said and within the things that he's already taught, the things he shared with his disciples. He just finished teaching, by the way, in an earlier chapter about the heir who is not free because he is not mature. Remember that story? He is the son of a wealthy father. He is under the control of people who are teaching him, who are raising him, who make him not free. They're his teachers, tutors, though he is technically the master. They're paid by his father. He's the owner of all things, yet he's not free. He has to do what they say. So Torah Shaul compares it to Torah. Torah is an instrument, a device of training. It makes a person not free. It limits their freedom, but for a good reason. There's a purpose behind that. So now a few words about freedom. A person who is free is not free to do whatever he wishes. He's still limited by the same rules, but he's not being held by the hand. He's not being forced. He's not being coerced or made to obey. A person who is free is choosing to do the right things. That is the kind of freedom that we're talking about. He's mature enough to make the right choice. That's why he is free. He's been liberated. He's been allowed to make his choices. So here he is, free to make mistakes, but he's still responsible for them. And the mature and wise person knows to follow the rules that his father has given him, the principles that he instilled in him in early age. He's free because he's been given freedom, and he's supposed to use this liberty, this freedom, wisely. That's really what we mean when we're talking about a person who is free. Again, there's going to be ideas of freedom and slavery all throughout Shaul's letter. And if we misunderstand what he means by freedom or by slavery, then we can kind of get sidetracked. And that's why I'm going over this again. Now, in Jewish mind, these two sons, both Isaac and Ishmael, are Abraham's sons. And they're equally his sons. Nobody is denying the fact that Abraham is not Ishmael's father, even though Sarah is not his mother. In Jewish tradition, at that time, it was the paternal, right to pass on their heritage, and it was done paternally. Even though today in modern Judaism it's done through matrilineal connections. Yet, as you read the stories of the patriarchs and on, all the kings of Israel and so on, it was always the father, not the mother. And so, from an ancient Jewish perspective, Ishmael is just as much a son as Isaac. Only the difference is the promise belongs to Isaac. That's the really only difference between them from that perspective. See, the term son of Abraham, ben Avraham, usually has several meanings. And this term actually comes up here in Galatians. Shaul calls Galatians sons of Abraham. Number one, it means Abraham's actual children, so the descendants of Abraham. Number two, it can mean Abraham's followers, so those who follow his way, those who follow the pattern of his faith, his followers. And number three, the son of Abraham can also be a name for a convert. An official convert in the synagogue in those days was called a son of Abraham, because he has chosen to follow the path of Abraham. Abraham modeled the path, and now he's following his path. So in the ancient days, that's what the converts were called. So when a convert is called to read the Torah, it's not his father's name that's called out, but Abraham becomes his father. So he is so-and-so, son of Abraham, regardless of whoever his father actually was. That's how he's called to the Torah, because he does become, in that sense, a son of Abraham. And so Galatians are actually called sons of Abraham. And we have to understand that issue. So, two sons, we understand that. One's from free, one from the woman who's not free. I'm going to keep revisiting that issue for a few more times. Let's look at verse 23 as Shaul continues. But the son by the bondwoman was born according to the flesh, and the son by the free woman through the promise. Verse 23 says that the son of the bondwoman, the one who is not free, was born of the flesh. What in the world does that mean? Well, it certainly does not mean that he was born of some fleshly desires or some sin. We have been, tracking Shaul for a while now and see how he uses the word flesh in the previous 3 chapters. And we saw how he's quite consistent is what he means by flesh. Sometimes what we mean by flesh is different than what he means by flesh. So flesh in Shaul's thinking is not something bad or evil. In fact, in traditional Jewish thinking, flesh is not evil or bad. We are as much material as we are spiritual. And it is our wholeness is what makes us human. So how can you say that God, what He's created, He created something evil? No, in a sense, that's a very foreign very, very pagan, dualistic sort of way of thinking that flesh is somehow sinful and bad and evil and corrupt and terrible in every way, and spirit is all good and pure and nice. That's really foreign thinking to Jewish minds. So flesh is just flesh. It's not bad or evil. In this particular letter, Shaul spoke of being perfected by the flesh. Remember in the very beginning, he says, you began in faith, now you want to be perfected by the flesh, meaning being circumcised in that context, which for them would be a natural way of becoming a part of God's family. You would be circumcised, you become part of God's family. That's how it was done in those days. So once they would do that, however, they would cease to be Gentiles and become Jews. So flesh for Shaul is a natural and a normal way of things. In a sense, it's not special. In a sense, it is the way of the world. It's ordinary. It is corrupted, as the rest of this world is corrupted. And it follows a predictable, predetermined path that the rest of the world follows. That's really what he means about flesh. Don't think about it necessarily as bad or evil, but think of it as just being natural. It's just part of this world system which we are part of. So that's flesh. The second son, the son of the free woman that verse 23 describes, he is born through the promise. Now you would have think the spirit, right? Flesh, spirit, think of dichotomy of the opposite word. But essentially it's the same thing. Joel says in verse 23 that he's born of the promise. And yes, of course, which promise is the question. Hashem did promise Abraham a son, right, in his old age. But if you stop right there and think that is the promise that Shaul talks about, is the promise of the son. Hey, Abraham, I'm going to give you descendants. You're going to miss a whole lot. That is legitimate. That is one of the promises that Hashem gave to Abraham. But there's also another promise. Shaul has been talking about Gentiles receiving Abraham's promise and being heirs to the promise. Think about it for a second. That cannot possibly refer to Isaac. If Gentiles are heirs of that promise, and Isaac is that promise, then how in the world are they connected now? You see, there's a problem with that. So Shaul plays on words a little bit here. When he speaks about Abraham, he speaks about sons, and he uses the word promise, most people automatically leap, okay, it's the promise of the son. But that may necessarily be that way. Promise, for Shaul, has a very special meaning in this particular letter. In this particular context, it's not the promise of the son, but the promise given to Abraham about what? That through him all the nations will be blessed. That is the promise. It's the eschatological anti-promise. It's something that is going to happen that is massive and global proportions promise. Not just that you're going to have a son. The point of you having a son is so that final big promise will actually come true. So, Abraham, I'm going to call you, I'm going to make you great, I'm going to magnify you, I'm going to make your descendants like the stars of heaven, and in you all the families will be blessed. In you all the families of the earth will be blessed. That's the promise that Shaul talks about in the book of Galatians so much. And he keeps going over it over and over. So, and of course, there's the blessing. The blessing comes through the seed. Shaul talked about the seed. Who is the seed? What is the seed? He calls the Messiah the seed. Shaul has taught this already to Galatians, and so Abraham will add to his family. That's what he's trying to say. This is a supernatural way as opposed to the natural way. Your family can grow two ways. And that's what he's saying. Abraham, you will have your son. That promise will be fulfilled. But guess what? In you, all the families of the earth will be blessed. They will be connected to you, Abraham. Your family is going to get bigger. Not the fact that I'm going to make you just as the stars, in the heaven, or as the sand on the seashore, but your family's going to get really big, and not always in a natural way, but some in a supernatural way. So the promise is supernatural. The promise is something miraculous. The promise is something that the Lord makes come true. It can happen through His power. That's the promise that Shaul was talking about. So that's what it means to be the son of promise, the one who is a fulfillment of that very thing that God has promised to do to Abraham. So let's jump on to verse 24 now and see the continuation of the story. Verse 24 says, This is allegorically speaking. So he's explaining to you that he's not speaking very directly. For these women are two covenants, one proceeding from Mount Sinai, being children who are to be slaves. She is Hagar. Wow. So in verse 24, Shaul tells you straightforward that what he's talking about is actually not direct speech, not something literal, but actually an allegory. So I want to take a short little pause aside from the actual verse to explain that. Many people are not sure what makes an allegory, actually. And so allegory is not a parable, and something a little bit different. Allegory is a very slippery thing. Why I say that? Because it is idiomatic thinking. You're thinking in a very representative terms, one could say. And so in allegory, things are not what they are. Something always stands for something else. That's an allegory. Different features of an allegory represent different ideas, different concepts. Allegory can be complicated for that very reason. Images are not what they are, but they are something else. Something that the author wants them to be for the point that he wants to make. See, what's really important is the point of the allegory. How you get there is not really the issue, and what meanings you assign to what features of your allegory is not really the issue. What's important is the point that the author wants to make. The allegory is merely a vehicle that's supposed to be entertaining and something that a person can imagine, visualize, and it will make an impact upon them. So it's a method. So one has to be a little bit of an abstract thinker to appreciate allegories. Allegories are very difficult because they are completely arbitrary. I mean, that's how they are. When people came up with this whole idea of allegorical interpretation of Scripture, that caused an incredible havoc because nobody could say what the Scripture means anymore, because they have assigned different items and different things to each feature of the passage, and they say, well, this means this means that. Well, who's to say that that means this and not something else? Well, see, it's completely arbitrary. I think, that in this particular story, this particular item means this. Well, you think it means something else. And so now we don't have a clear meaning of that passage. And so only an author of the allegory can actually say what things stand for. And there's usually a key for interpreting images that he paints to his listeners. And sometimes the author gives that key. Well, Shaul actually gives this key in his own allegory. He actually explains his own allegory in sort of way. Allegory says that what you see is not what it is, and there's another meaning behind what the plain facts of the story are. Kind of like the idea of sod in rabbinic exegesis. If you're familiar with the idea of rabbinic exegesis, how the rabbis interpreted the Scripture for ages and ages, the system we call pardes, right? Pshat, Remez, Darash, and Sod. These four levels of interpretation. There's the literal meaning, there's a hint, there's an expanded meaning, an explanatory meaning, more historical kind of deeper explanation, and Sod is being the mystical type meaning, indirect, allegorical meaning. So Jews used allegories actually long time before Yeshua, before Shaul's day. Greeks, by the way, did that as well, but they did it in a slightly different way. For example, for Jews, allegorical meaning of something never means that something is a better or true meaning. See, Jews never take allegorical meaning of any verse or any scripture as being a better or superb, more superior meaning. You see, allegorical meaning never replaces the plain and simple meaning. The plain and simple meaning always remains paramount. The allegorical meaning, it has to harmonize with the simple meaning, actually. It can never be opposite. It can never contradict the plain sense of the text. Allegorical meaning can never alter the revelation of God that one already possesses. And it simply can't take you away from that which is already to be true. So that is one of the things that I can think of at the moment about how Jewish allegorical interpretation is vastly different from a Greek allegorical interpretation, because in Greek allegorical interpretation, it is the preferred meaning. The allegorical meaning in that school of interpretation is the true meaning. You see, there's this surface meaning that everybody sees and understands, the historical sort of, say, scenario. And then the person looks behind and says, well, the real meaning is this. And then the true meaning starts to supersede. It starts to be more important. It's more real. Where does it come from? It comes from Greek philosophy, Platonism, Platonic thought. It talks about this world is not the real world. There's another world that is more real than this world that we live in. We're living in a world of shadows and gimmicks. Then there's the real world. There's the substance, and we're just experiencing these little shadows and glimmers and things that we don't even understand. So when you think of Platonic word, now you understand that the allegorical meaning, the higher meaning, the spiritual meaning, the meaning that's mystical, actually to be the true meaning. And that became the school of interpretation. Actually in the Christian church at certain points of its development. So the reason why I'm saying about this is because allegory is a slippery thing. And we have to understand that interpreting allegory can be very tricky and very different unless the author of the allegory actually provides us the keys to understanding. Unless he tells you, by this I mean this. Or at least if you understand the author who is telling you the allegory, and you understand the world he lives in, you understand how he thinks and what images he ascribes to those particular features of the allegory, maybe you can guess what in the world he's talking about. Well, Shaul does that. He kind of provides us some of the keys. So in verse 24, Shaul says that these women are two covenants. He tells you what he's talking about. Well, he doesn't tell you which covenants they are, right? So don't allow your mind to jump yet there. And it's a big clue, by the way. So it's part of the keys to this allegory. Hold on to this idea, and let's say Shaul proceeds to tell us in verse 24 that one woman is connected to Mount Sinai. So that gives you a clue about which covenant he's talking about. It's okay. So one woman is Mount Sinai. She's Hagar, he says. And she bears children who are not free. Interesting. Of course, Mount Sinai, we know, is the place where Israel receives the commandments. But it is Hagar, Shaul says, not Sarah. Wait a minute. Were Ishmaelites standing at the foot of Mount Sinai? Were Ishmaelites the one receiving the commandments? As far as I remember the story, it was Amalekites who attacked Israelites in the desert. Who are Amalekites? Well, guess what? Amalek is the grandson of Esau. And Esau intermarried with Ishmael, and that's where these guys are coming from, Amalekites. So, were the Ishmaelites standing at the foot of Sinai? Did they come out of Egypt? No. So why in the world is he saying Hagar is Mount Sinai? Why is she Mount Sinai? Is it the Arabia? No. Arabia is this nebulous part of the world that in ancient days that the peninsula that Jews referred to as this whole region of the world. What we call today the Arabian Peninsula. That's what Jews called Arabia, basically. Anything kind of beyond River Jordan and south, So what is he talking about? Why is Hagar connected to Mount Sinai? Hagar bears children who are slaves, he says. So in which way is Hagar and her children are slaves? In which way are they not free? In the same exact way that a person who is a master yet is under authority of his teachers and caregivers, he's not free. See, this is where you and I sometimes get confused by the concept of slavery that we have, the modernity, the most recent experience of slavery that we know for us historical. We get sidetracked because when we think in slavery, we think that kind of slavery. We're not thinking an institution of slavery that existed in biblical times. And by the way, Torah talks about that quite a bit. And by the way, Romans had it, and it was legal, and existed, and it wasn't exactly the same kind of slavery that you and I think about. So when I use slavery or servanthood, a lot of times I would say we're not free, just to bring out to the reality of what it really actually means. Being not free, being limited. So how are they not free? They're not free just like a person who is under a tutor, under a schoolmaster, is not free. He is limited in his capacity to do whatever he wants. He has to do what he's told. So he's bound by the rules, has to obey them, whatever his teachers tell him. Slavery, or non-freedom, is a state of being. It's a state of being. It's a status. It's not about sinfulness. It's not about the lack of virtue. It's actually a state that one is born into. Some people are born into slavery. Well, what did they do to deserve it? Well, they were born into it. This is how they are. And that's what Shaul actually says, that we come into this world in this status. We come into this world living a natural life, experiencing world for all the worldliness that it is. Experiencing world from a very touch and feel, I can see this, therefore it's real perspective. But then at some point we can be free from that perspective by discovering the world that we cannot see, the world that we may not understand, but yet we realize that it's just as real as the world that we can feel and touch. There's a world behind this world that we have been created to interact with because we're spiritual beings. We realize that within us there's a capacity to go beyond the touch-feel world that we consider to be concrete and natural. There is something supernatural. So that's what we're talking about. Slavery in itself is not something bad. It's just a social status, a particular dynamic of a person's life, a state of being in which one simply is born and exists. So the implication was clear to Galatians and clear to Paul. They understood that Shaul lived in a life that had slavery as an institution. He wrote his advices, spiritual life lessons, keeping in mind that some people are slaves and some people have slaves, and how they're supposed to live their life of faith, having that kind of institution being a part of their reality of life. So he fully understood that. So here we are talking about this woman who's not free, Mount Sinai, Hagar, she has children, they're not free. What he means by them is that they're confined, they're limited, they have to do what they're told. There's a path to freedom, but they have to go that path first. And at the moment, they're not free. Doesn't mean they're bad or immoral or anything like that. At the moment, they're not free. So let's go on, verse 25 and 26. Keep following the logic that he's laying out before us. Now, this Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia and corresponds to present Jerusalem, for she is in slavery with her children. But the Jerusalem above is free. She is our mother. Verse 25 says that Hagar is represented by Mount Sinai in Arabia, and she is Jerusalem. But Jerusalem is not free. She is in slavery. Now, if you're thinking Isaac and Ishmael right now, if you're still thinking Jews and Arabs, if you're still thinking Jews and Gentiles, you'll be completely lost here, because the allegory will leave the plane of your understanding, and you will have to leap to some crazy conclusions to understand what in the world Shaul is talking about. That's the kind of thinking that you have to leave behind in order to understand what he's saying. Hagar represents Jewish people who received the Torah. Think, Hagar represents Jewish people who received the Torah. The Torah, the tutor, at Sinai. And now they're not free. In which way they're not free? They're limited. They're confined to the covenant, to the stipulations which they were given, all these rules. They have not reached their maturity to be free yet. Just because they're not free now doesn't mean they'll never be free. Because remember, the heir, once he reaches the spiritual maturity, when he's able to be his father's son, he receives all of his inheritance and the capacity to make whatever decisions he wants to make in life, because he's mature. So, not mature yet, not free yet. They're confined by the Torah for their own good, because they're not yet ready to make those responsible choices. This is what Shaul means by slavery. Not slavery, the oppressive, terrible, impossible to fulfill law, as some people teach. Hagar is Jerusalem, he says. Jews who did not recognize the time of their visitation. Think about that. Still not mature, still have not reached that spiritual plane of understanding of what is it that God is doing in this world. Not being able to see the reality that is not touch and feel reality, but spiritual reality. Not being able to connect to that. Did not recognize the time the Messiah has come. Why? Because he didn't look the way that he was expected to look. It has nothing to do with Hagar, actually. It's nothing has to do with the fact that Hagar, historical reality, she's the father of the Arab people. See, Hagar is just an image. Don't let that, sway you away from the story. Remember that this story is an allegory. It's not supposed to all line up 100%. He's simply telling you something that represents something else. And sometimes he does that just on purpose, to kind of get your attention, grab your attention. Slavery is a natural path, if you think about it. It's an ordinary path. It's a usual, expected route. You are born this way, you kind of grow up in this world, you learn the ways of the world, and you just kind of roll with it. Because that's what you know, that's the only things you've ever experienced in your life, is what everybody else is doing, and you're saying that's reality. Reality is what's happening around me, and that's what everybody else is doing. But remember, there's also a supernatural path. There's promise. Promise is supernatural. And through Sarah comes the son of promise in the story. And remember what promise means to Shaul. It's that maturity, it's that fullness, it's the complete fulfillment of things that were promised to Abraham. Except Sarah is actually not mentioned in the story. It's only implied. Isn't that interesting? Hagar's name is mentioned, but Sarah's name is not mentioned. It's merely implied in this allegory. I think it's on purpose. Once again, it's not about genetics, it's about spiritual dynamics. You see, you're not supposed to be tracing lineage here, as we're used to do with genealogies. What you're supposed to be doing is tracing spiritual dynamics that took place. And Shaul is telling you what spiritual dynamic he wants you to see in this little allegory, this little midrash, little story that he's telling you. Verse 26 says that Jerusalem above is free. It's very important. She's our mother. So, there's Jerusalem below, and there's Jerusalem above. You ever heard about that before? This must have gone a little bit over the heads of Galatians, unless they were taught this specifically. One has to read some writings of the prophets. One has to know a little bit about Jewish tradition to understand what in the world Shaul is talking about when he says Jerusalem above. There are two cities. The one that is free happens to be in heaven, somewhere up there. And remember what freedom represents. It stands for maturity, for fulfillment. Fulfillment of the promises given to Abraham. The blessing of the nations. I told you before that Shaul, like many Jews of his time, he thinks in a very end-time, very eschatological way. He can't get away from it. Most Jews of his times are eschatological thinkers, very ethnocentric, and very self-focused. That's how they see the world. They have a particular cosmology, they have a particular worldview, and they kind of think through that. And even if they try to think like everybody else, they still can't escape it because so much of their world is wrapped in their way of life. So that's what he thinks about, and that's why he talks about the Jerusalem above. He's talking about end times. At the right time, the promise of the fullness will come true. And Jerusalem above will do what? Come down to earth. Sounds familiar? Sounds familiar? What is Jerusalem above? Well, Jerusalem above is the better version of the one that's here below. You see, there's this real, natural, essential touch and feel life, right? But then there's something that's just as real that you really can't touch and feel, but you know it's out there. And this is what God is saying by casting this vision, this idea of Jerusalem that's not here, but it's out there. And it is infinitely better, actually. Because before we look at the citation from Tanakh that follows these verses, I want to point out to you that Shaul is actually a brilliant storyteller. You see, he uses an imagery, a very sophisticated imagery over here. He uses religious imagery. You may not even realize this as you're reading this, because you may not understand what the world of Galatians was like. Sarah and Hagar, Mount Sinai and Mount Zion. This may sound obscure to us at the moment, but it makes a lot of sense to Galatians. When they hear the names of these two women, when they hear of them as being called mothers, and when they hear the references to mountains. Why is this important? Because if you study ancient Galatia, where they lived, and the peoples who lived there, you will learn that this province, this area we called Anatolia, worshipped what we call Anatolian Mother Goddess. They worshipped Mother Goddess, which is a fertility goddess. It's just another different variety. It's very, you sort of say, connected to all the other fertility goddesses that are there. You know, call her Aphrodite or Ashroth or Esther or anything you want to call her. It doesn't really matter. There are many kinds of fertility goddesses in this time, but so she's one of the kind. And so she is called Meter, by the way, which basically means mother. She's a mother goddess. And archaeologists have found these little figurines, these little effigies, these depictions of this mother goddess, and she sits on the throne, and her throne is a mountain. She was called Mountain Mother, or Mountain Goddess sometimes. Her throne is a mountain. It's like her throne is just mountain overgrows and makes a chair, and she's sitting on a throne. So she's like a part of a mountain, and she's not the mountain. Well, if you look at this region of where Galatia is, you would see that there's a lot of mountains in the region. They actually live surrounded by the mountains. And so it would be natural for people to worship mountains and connect something spiritual and something divine to those mountains. So they have this idea of a mother goddess that is connected to a mountain. She's a mountain goddess. She's the goddess of fertility. She provides all these things. She's benevolent to her children. They pray to her. They have temples. They have, figurines of her. All these kinds of things. This is Anatolian folk religion. So now just imagine how brilliant Shaul is by telling you this allegory in which he uses the image of mothers and mountains. Mountains are mothers. Mothers are mountains. And it makes no sense to you, perhaps, but it makes perfect sense to Galatians, who just came out of this stuff, what this is all about. Do you know that the consort of Mother Goddess had a consort who was, by the way, castrated. And the priests who served the Mother Goddess, they castrated themselves to show their devotion, their allegiance to Mother Goddess in imitation of the consort. And that's what they did. The priests, by the way, were called Galli, the same word from which we get Galatia. They're the Gauls. Okay, so it's interesting that this is here, because there's another place in Galatians where you can kind of pick up on this idea of when Shaul tells basically his opponents that they should go and mutilate themselves. They should go and castrate themselves. If they're so bent on circumcision, they can circumcise themselves and circumcise a little bit too much, basically. That's what he's saying. He's poking kind of humor at them, but you see, to Galatians it makes total sense. Because once you start talking about castration, in their context of folk worship that they were familiar with, that is the sign of devotion and belonging to the Mother Goddess. It's the ultimate step of faith, if you want to call it, to become a priest of the Mother Goddess. So again, this is all history, this is all ancient, durable, archaeological stuff. But it's there, and we can still uncover it, and we can read it. And so now as we're reading Galatians, all of a sudden it starts to inform us. And that's why I say that Shaul is actually a phenomenal storyteller. He's very talented in the way that he captures the imagery that they already know and understand so well, and now he recasts it. You see, so it's very familiar to Galatians. They appreciate it, how familiar this is to them. So what he's saying is, through this allegory, he's showing Galatians their new identity. He says, there's a new mother that you can identify with. She's the free one. She's Jerusalem from above. Jerusalem from above. Again, it may not make as much sense to us, but it surely makes sense to Galatians. So if we understand how they feel about this imagery, well, perhaps it will enhance our understanding of what in the world Shaul is talking about, and why is he telling this allegory about these mothers and mountains. So hopefully this solves a little bit of mystery for you. So let's move on to the actual quotation here, verse 27. As verse 27 takes a quote directly from the Tanakh. For it is written, rejoice, barren woman, who does not bear. Break forth and shout, you who are not in labor. For more numerous are the children of the desolate than of the one who has a husband. And you, brethren, like Isaac, are children of promise. Now, so here's a quote. This is a direct quote from Tanakh. What is it all about? It's about Jerusalem. That's what it's about. Jerusalem is barren. This is a typical way the prophets use metaphors of barrenness to show the incompleteness of Jerusalem. Something is missing. She's not whole. She is not even in labor, it says, but she has more children than others who have a husband.
Do you see the irony of the speech? It's a hyperbolic speech. It's a complete exaggeration. So you know this is not something very literal. You know this is a prophetic way of saying something so extreme to help you understand what in the world the prophet is talking about. You've got to be able to see the big picture, not concentrate on the tiny little minute details. That's the only way you can interpret prophecies like this. So she's not in labor. She has more children than others, even though they have the husband. So in prophetic analogy, God actually himself is the husband, right? He's the husband of Jerusalem. Think about it. And so the city's desolation makes it look as if the city doesn't have a husband. Jerusalem is destroyed, in ruins. The people are led out into captivity. They're slaves. What's happening? Well, it looks like Jerusalem doesn't have a God. It looks like Jerusalem doesn't have a husband. Nobody cares for her because this has been allowed to happen. Desolation. See? But in fact, she has more children than the other cities. The other cities that appear to have their gods intact and who are caring for them. What's her secret? Where do these children come from? Promise. They're supernatural children. See? They're supernatural children. Let me unravel this for you a little bit more. Jerusalem above is the heavenly city described in Isaiah 54. And this quote is actually from Isaiah 54. Now, New Jerusalem, if you kind of want to read about it, Ezekiel 36 through 48, a big chunk of Ezekiel describes this new city, describes in great details all the porticos of the temple and how tall and how high and how wide, all these great details, and the city gates and everything. And it says that the city gets more children than she has ever had. Because guess what? If you study the eschatology, if you study the end times, if you study the prophecies of this particular period, this restoration the prophet speaks about, Jerusalem receives people who are returning. The Jews come back to Jerusalem after its desolation. And when they come back, they don't come back alone. They bring Gentiles along with them, the prophets say. So the city gets more children than it ever had. These are the children of promise. This all happens in the end time. We read from multiple prophets that the nations come to worship in Jerusalem. That Jerusalem becomes a place not just for Israel, but for many nations to come and worship the Lord. That's what we read about, plain and simple, in so many different prophets. So this is not what's happening in Galatia right now, is not the fullest fulfillment of the prophets given to Abraham. It's a beginning. But in him, all the families of the earth are being blessed and will be blessed even more so. So, interpreting these verses, gets a little bit tricky, but I think we can do it. And that's why in verse 28, when we see after that quote, Shaul says that Galatians are like Isaac. See, he tells you the key to solution of this quote. He tells you what the quote is about. Galatians are like Isaac. You are the children of promise. The children of promise come back to Jerusalem with the Jews. They are the beginning of the fulfillment of the promise, according to Shaul. And that is why he's trying to show to them that their status and their identity of Messiah is marvelous and supernatural. They need to accept it, they need to believe it, and they do not need to search any further. Because God has given them the final fulfillment of the things in their life that the promises predict. Galatians, by not going the route of circumcision, are no less the sons of Abraham. That's what Shaul keeps talking to them about. They do not become Jews. They constitute those nations who are blessed by Abraham through the seed, through Yeshua, in the end times. They're like Isaac. They're supernatural children, children of promise. They're not born, they're not appearing in a natural way, because what would be the natural way? Well, the natural way would be to circumcise them and make them Jews. Then it would become the natural sons of Abraham. They'll be adopted in the family the way that adoption has always been done. But this is a supernatural adoption through the Spirit. Through God simply breaking into their lives and making a new heart within them, without them going and formally making the application. Can I be part of the people of God? See, this is God doing it in His own way. So the fact that Jews believe in their God and seek righteousness, I don't know, you don't think about it this way sometimes, but it's actually natural. The fact that Jews believe in God and seek righteousness and want to move into this direction, that is natural. It's normal. It is essential. Why? Because God created the nation that way. God took an old man and an old woman and said, okay, you're barren, you can't have children. Guess what? I'm going to make you great. I'm going to make your name great. I'm going to multiply. I'm going to make children out of you. I'm going to make nations out of you. And guess what's going to happen? And God began that, and He creates a nation out of nothing. So, naturally, the nation is expected to follow in the trajectory which God has set for them. But you know what's unnatural? You know what's supernatural? Is the Gentiles attaching to them to this. That's supernatural. That is a miracle.
That's right.
See, Jewish people accepting their own destiny, following their own path, is actually natural. But it is the non-Jews who are coming into this from far away. That is supernatural. That is a miracle. Shaul sees that. And he doesn't want it to stop. He doesn't want it to go away, which is why he fights for his Gentile disciples, for them to remain Gentile, for them not to become Jews. So you see, that's his kind of passion right there. So let's read 29 through 31 as we get to finish this chapter. But at that time, he who was born according to the flesh persecuted him who was born according to the Spirit. So it is now also. But what does the Scripture say? Cast out the bondwoman and her son. For the son of the bondwoman shall not be an heir with the son of the free woman. So then, brethren, we are not children of bondwoman, but of free woman. Well, it's a difficult part. Difficult part because it's so easy to misinterpret. Verse 29 says that the naturally born persecuted the promised child, the one who was born of the Spirit, essentially. So this is similar to what's happening with Galatians, Shaul says. Ishmael persecuted Isaac. Remember the story. Well, how did he persecute him? Well, he taunted him. That's what Midrash says, Isaac was younger. He wasn't firstborn, but he was a miracle child. He was mocked, yet he was the heir that was promised all things. Galatians are heirs through Yeshua, born through the Spirit, born supernaturally. Not Jewish, yet having the benefits of something that was actually promised to Abraham and to his children. So that's why they're persecuted. Who are they persecuted by? What is the analogy that Shaul is trying to draw? They are pressured. They are persecuted to become the sons of Abraham in the natural way. Something has happened to them, something beautiful, something supernatural, something really majestic has happened to them. And now they're being pressured to do what everybody else does. Go the way of the world. Do like everybody else. Follow the same path that everybody else walks. Don't bother the fact that you don't need to take this path because you found another path. Just, this is the way everybody goes, so you go the same way. This is the way we do it. Come on, follow it. See, Shaul's opponents sometimes accused him of teaching Jews to forsake Torah. That's what he's been accused of. Well, we know that that's not the case. He did not. He did, however, teach the Gentiles that they did not need to become Jews to take on the yoke of the Torah the same way Jews took it on themselves at Mount Sinai. He's saying that's not necessary. Why? Because it's not about the Torah, it's about the end goal. The Torah is a vehicle, a tutor, a teacher, a trainer who gets you to what? To be mature, to be able to receive the promise. So why would you want to concentrate on this vehicle where the goal, the end result, is freely available to you right now? And it's actually happening in your life miraculously, supernaturally. So that's the idea. For Shaul, they were persecuted. He was persecuted as well for this very idea. The fact that he proposed this made him persecuted. Because prior to this moment in history, Gentiles, they all had to be circumcised, they all had to become Jews. They start to attach themselves to the promises of Abraham. That's the only path for them. So Shaul is saying, no, God is doing something new. This is the new part, the new development. God is fulfilling Abraham's blessing, Abraham's promise. Don't stop it. Don't get in the way. Don't try to make them go in the natural way because God has already accepted them. Remember the story of Cornelius. What is the reaction of Peter? He says, I can't do anything. I had to baptize them because how can I stand in the way of God? God has poured out His Spirit upon them. Can I withhold baptism? If they are truly God's, and it's completely clear that supernaturally they're sealed for God, there's manifestations of God being present in their life, how can I tell them, oh no, you can't be baptized? Well, wait a minute, you have to be circumcised first, then I'll baptize you. Because that's how it was done in Judaism. First you get circumcised, then you get baptized. I mean, Jews practiced baptism in those days too. It was just a little bit different, but same idea. So you have to understand that this is the scenario that's happening. There's something supernatural occurring with these people that, from Shaul's perspective, we shouldn't stand in their way. We shouldn't force them into the natural path that has been there for generations. So he opposed that and he wanted them to remain witnesses so that the promise is being fulfilled. That this is the time. This is the eschatological moment. This is the beginning of the end time for Shaul, where Gentiles all of a sudden miraculously turning to God this way. To him, that's the most exciting thing. That's why he becomes the apostle of Gentiles. That's the message that he sees in the road to Damascus. You see, that's why he goes to Arabia to meditate and learn these things. The story that he was telling you in the book of Galatians about himself, he tells you for a reason. He wants you to understand how much he believes that and how that much is a mission of his life. So verses 30 and 31, right here, let's see. They talk about casting out the bondwoman. That's the difficult part right here. Shaul does not tell Galatians to cast out the other sons. Think about it for a second. He's not telling them to cast out the other sons. He merely quotes the Torah. This is a direct quote from Genesis that alludes that perhaps these teachers, remember, this is his analogical, allegorical way of speaking. He's alluding that perhaps these teachers who are confusing Galatians, they should be kicked out. That's what he's trying to hint to. If you want a remez, this is your remez right there. There's your hint. He quotes a Torah verse and he kind of hints at, hey, they got kicked out, maybe you should kick these guys out. He's applying the principles of Torah to a new situation. So he merely suggests this. And what he says is the inheritance Galatians have is the inheritance that they will not be sharing with the sons of Hagar, who are not free. They're not ready for that inheritance. They have different paths right now. They're in a different place with God. They have different purposes laid out for them. This is what he means when he says, we are sons of free women. We have gotten to this point. They haven't. Remember, free and slave. We think of free as good, slave as bad. Don't think of a slave that way because, as I explained, the idea of slavery, it's not necessarily was looked upon